Was Paul truly a Torah teacher? If we are realizing that we want to know the Creator's written Torah and we want to return to His ways, we are also realizing that the traditions of men have not always been right. The things that we've heard in the past, some of them have been right and some of them have been wrong. If we care about the Torah and we consider ourselves truth seekers and we want to be careful about accepting traditions, we might wonder about traditionally accepted prophets and teachers, and we want to test these things according to the written Torah. As a result, we need to take these issues individually and compare them with the written Torah and see, does this really fit with it? And this might lead us to looking at Paul at some point. Maybe seriously now, just for the first time, or maybe we're returning back to the issue because the questions that we had about Paul were never truly resolved for us, and now they've arisen again. We might know that some of Paul's teachings are ambiguous, or at times they might seem questionable to us. In response, depending upon the circles that we are in, and depending upon those that we might surround ourselves with, we might try to reduce certain feelings or lower the number of questions that arise for us regarding Paul, such as by referring to 2 Peter. 2 Peter says that Paul's writings are misunderstood, but 2 Peter doesn't actually say how they're being misunderstood or what the supposed meaning of Paul's teachings actually is. But we know that regardless of how some people might describe Paul, we still do have to consider what Paul himself says, how he presents himself, and what he himself teaches. What someone else has said about Paul, or a belief that might be held about Paul, does not change that. And seeking the truth about Paul would mean recognizing his own words. The first thing to consider with Paul is that Paul is just one person of many included in the New Testament. He did author a large number of the books that have been included most of the time in the New Testament. But Paul is his own person, and we should treat him as such. Paul has a different writing style. Paul has different mannerisms and a different personality and a different way of presenting himself. Paul has a different background and different relationships when we contrast him with the 12 apostles. He was not a part of the original 12. He was not present for the events in the Gospels. And he was not chosen as the replacement 12th apostle. Instead, he expressed being at odds with others, such as in Galatians 2. He is a separate and independent person. In considering Paul separately, we might also consider his presumed Pharisaic connections. Paul says he was a Pharisee in the past that was blameless according to the law. This is interesting because I've seen in some Messianic circles the statement about being a Pharisee treated as a positive thing or a proof that Paul teaches the Torah. The idea that because he was a Pharisee, he must teach the Torah, we might want to consider whether that is a standard that we would want to apply consistently. Does every single Pharisee or rabbi teach the written Torah? Does every single former Pharisee or former rabbi teach the written Torah? Probably not. We probably don't assume that. So if we want to be consistent, we might want to separate that idea from the general issue of what Paul teaches. someone can change or adjust his beliefs, whether in small or in big ways, and we know that Paul himself changed his beliefs. And if we consider how Paul teaches now, we could also notice how he quotes Greek religious works a number of times, even in Acts where he seems to be preaching on the spot, off the cuff, and he's quoting two of these Greek religious works from memory. So his background goes beyond just saying that he was a Pharisee. So the Pharisee idea is not the universal answer to all questions about Paul. It is not something that has the ability to change what he teaches. Paul is not dumb. He was a smart guy, and he tailored his teaching and his presentation for his audience. We're probably familiar with the verses where he actually says that. He said that he becomes like his audience. And knowing that, we have something to consider. For what reason would Paul teach Gentiles such that only Jewish rabbis would understand it? If he is the apostle to the Gentiles according to himself, and if he's a smart guy and he's tailoring his teaching, then wouldn't he want to simplify the issue? Couldn't he have consistently and plainly stated that the written Torah was to be followed if that was his intent? Keep in mind that most of his audience did not have a Pharisaic background, and he knew that his letters were being circulated around to other people. And knowing that, what did Paul expect them to conclude from his writings? If we look at the writings of Paul, we can find verses here and there that say, the law is good, or that we establish the law. Or we might look at verses that refer to the works of the law and assume this must be about the oral traditions, and that maybe he's not talking about the written law. While that might be an interesting way to approach some verses, how odd could a person consider it that Paul doesn't actually contrast works of the law with the written Torah? Isn't it curious that he doesn't actually make that distinction between them? He speaks of works as opposed to faith, and works as opposed to grace, and he makes a contrast between two covenants. The covenant on the mountain, where the 10 Commandments were given, which he refers to as a covenant of bondage, as opposed to a different covenant with Jerusalem above. And he makes a contrast between two ministries. That which was written in the tablets of stone, which he refers to as the ministry of death, as opposed to his ministry of the Spirit. So even if we might be able to work around some verses by treating the phrase works of the law in that way and use some sense of ambiguity to argue for the written Torah, we might also want to consider the lack of ambiguity in other verses, such as the aforementioned passages about the covenant on the mountain in Galatians 4 and the tablets of stone in 2 Corinthians 3. And this gets into the primary issue that I want us to draw attention to. In Paul's writings, he is teaching. He is giving a presentation. What is his overarching point? As mentioned, we can assume that he is a Pharisee, which means he must be teaching the Torah somehow. But compare the writings of Paul with the plainly written book of Deuteronomy. How many different ways does Deuteronomy say to follow all of the commands of the law? How many times is it repeated in that book? It is a point that is driven home over and over in Deuteronomy in a vast number of different ways with no ambiguity about it. If we look back at Paul, Isn't it interesting that despite all the opportunities he had, we never see him plainly tell people to follow every command of the written Torah? If that was Paul's overarching point, especially since he was primarily teaching people that didn't have a background in the Torah, wouldn't we see him plainly state that at least once? Should it really take a multiple 100-page commentary to extract that from what he is supposedly saying, if that's really what he's saying? We should not have to rewrite everything Paul says in order to make it teach the Torah, if it actually does. And we shouldn't have to focus on a couple of vague verses in isolation to try to override all of the times he teaches about things like the written ministry of death. We want to consider that Paul's his own person. He was never a part of the 12, and he has his own teachings. We also have to consider that Paul is not dumb. He knows his audience. If he really intended people to follow the written Torah and ignore the oral traditions, he could have easily said that in an explicit and plain way. He could have easily just quoted a verse from Deuteronomy where it says to keep everything that is written in the Torah. But he didn't. Testing Paul is something that we owe to ourselves to take seriously. If we are seeking the truth, and if we want to return to the written Torah, to return to the Creator's truth, then this may mean changing the way we look at some of the books that were included in the Protestant canon. This includes the writings of Paul. We may have to reevaluate some of our assumptions that we've adopted, and some of these assumptions may still be present in the groups that we fellowship with. But what is more important? If there are teachings that are not in line with the Torah, that go against the Torah, would we rather hold on to them and pay attention to them? Or would we rather let go of them and seek out what really matters? Let us return to the truth of his ways, and let us focus on them, because his ways are for all of the days.